Happy hump day!
How y'all doing? Welcome to midweek.
Today we're gonna have some fun, hang out with your friends, learn about Jesus. It's gonna be good, right?
All
Right. Let's get into it.
Hey students, welcome back to Home Groups 2020. So glad that we are able to gather together tonight in different homes throughout Gainesville as well as online to talk about these tough questions of our faith. And the big one tonight is, does God exist? And kind of backtracking a little bit from last week because we talked about how do I know God exists when I don't feel Him or know or see Him that He's here. And so now we're asking the question like, well, how do we know He exists in the first place? When I think about that question, I think about a few years ago how Katerina and I were in the woods outside of Bakersfield, California. We're out visiting family, took a day to go hiking in the mountains. And for tonight, just think about, like, imagine we got lost in the woods. We didn't, but imagine we got lost in the woods that hiking trip. We run out of food, we run out of water, and we're trying to find our way back home. But as we are stumbling our way through the wilderness, we stumble upon a cabin in the woods. Now the cabin is unlocked, so we walk in the cabin trying to find water, and we find out that the air conditioning is on 72 degrees, which is great because California is hot. We have a TV on in the background playing our favorite TV show. We walk into another room, it's playing music that we enjoy, and then we walk over to the kitchen and open up the fridge, which has a sign that says your favorite drinks. And on it, or in it, we find lemonade, we find Dr. Pepper, and we find a whole case of LaCroix there ready for us to drink, and it is the best time. Now imagine that takes place. And the question we have to ask is, did that cabin just happen to appear there randomly, or was it put there by somebody else? And the answer is the latter. It had to be put there by somebody else because things like that just don't happen. And not only that, the cabin was tailor-made for us. And as we think about that on a broader scale, I want you all to think about that in terms of the world that we live in. How do we know God exists, or does God exist? We can't answer that question using the scientific method because we can't have a set of pair of things set in place and a measurable test, a repeatable test that we can do as we're going to find God at the end of it. You know, God doesn't work that way, so we can't scientifically prove through the scientific method that God exists. In fact, I think about this scripture verse that comes to mind. Luke 16:31 says, well, Jesus says, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded if someone rises from the dead. What Jesus pretty much is saying that is there's a danger of demanding so much evidence to the point where someone has no choice but to believe in it. In other words, to put it in another way, God's existence cannot be demonstrated to another person with the kind of certainty that forces him to believe. The evidence may be powerful, but one must choose to believe. And this is where faith comes in, not against the evidence, but as a response to it. So a decision must be based on sufficient evidence, not on exhaustive evidence. To put it another way, because God is not perceived by our five senses, we must rely upon the indirect evidence of cause and effect. And to bring it back to the story I just shared, we know that the effect of what we see, the fact that there was a cabin in the woods tailor-made for both Katerina and Maya's interest, we know that there has to be a reasonable cause behind it. That just didn't happen on accident. Cause and effect. And so using that, tonight there's 5 quick, brief arguments that we can use using that model to explain the existence of God that we're going to walk through together. And the first one is simply this, the Cosmological Argument. Cosmology is the study of the origin of the universe. So looking at the universe, looking at space, how can we deduce that God exist from looking outside of our own world. And it's quite simply, actually, we know the universe had a beginning, right? It doesn't happen one day and here it is, and it doesn't exist outside of time. It doesn't exist, it's not eternal. And so we know that the universe began to exist. We know that from science and philosophy. Therefore, there has to be a cause outside of the universe that is personal, powerful, intelligent, spaceless, and timeless. Because all reasons and observations tell us that nothing produces nothing. You can't expect nothing to produce something. It doesn't work that way. For instance, when we were down in Naples this past week, and Katerina and I went to a donut shop, and they made the best donuts, by the way. And as we were waiting there in line, we noticed that they made all the donuts fresh. And every single time, the baker had to put the batter into a machine, and on the outside of the machine came out the donuts. What they imported was what was exported out the other side. The baker just didn't do anything, nothing, and then donuts came out. There had to be something in order for donuts to come out the other end. And that's the cosmological argument there, that the universe exists, and therefore there has to be a reason why it exists. And there's more reasons to it, and you're going to talk about that in small groups, some more examples of why we know that the universe had a beginning. It's not essentially eternal, but it actually started at one point in the past. But for right now, this argument, I want y'all to land on this point here, that the beginning of the universe points toward a beginner. And the second argument is this one, the fine-tuning of the universe, or in other words, the teleological argument. Now, have you guys ever been to Disney World or Disneyland? If you had the privilege of being there, you would have noticed alongside the entry that there's a bed of flowers laid along a sloping bank. Its colors and patterns form a resemblance to Mickey Mouse, and no one's going to attribute that gardening to mere chance. The flowers and the placement clearly indicate complexity in putting that together. And the argument makes the point that life, laws of nature, and the universe altogether have an immense specified complexity, the mark of design. And there is a list of universal laws that if they were changed by a mere decimal point or 1 degree, that life as it exists would not exist. If one of our laws of nature were changed even by the minute decimal, life wouldn't exist as we know it now. And here's a list of some of those laws for you guys to look upon. The gravitational force, the expansion rate of universe, the placement of the planet to the sun, strong nuclear force, oxygen level, Moon-Earth gravity relation, placement of the solar system in the galaxy. All of this proves to us that the fine-tuning of the universe points towards a fine-tuner. Just like the cabin in the woods, it was made specifically for us, tailor-made for what Katerina and I enjoy. And there's no other question that it was put there by someone. And just like the world we live in today, it's so perfectly made for humans to exist. There's no other explanation outside the fact that someone had to design it with us in mind. And the third argument is the argument of DNA. Do you know how much information is in your body? How much DNA that is, or how much information is in each DNA strand in your body? Well, think about it this way. The amount of information inside one cell in your body is an equivalent of 500,000 movies. You know, in other words, that's 500,000 movies. Now, I know some of you probably tried to hit that number during quarantine and isolation, but that's a lot of movies to have that much information. That's just in one cell in your body, and just imagine how much more cells there are in your body, and you can do the math there. And so, in other words, the immense number of information There's simply too much information in our bodies to have existed just randomly by chance over millions of years. And you'll talk about that again in small groups, and some more studies you show that. But for instance, if you walk along the beach, you just see writing in the sand that says Chris was here. You won't assume that the waves made it. You'll assume that a person named Chris wrote that in the sand, and that information points towards an author. And we see the same thing with even the DNA in our body, which leads us to the point here. Just like the information in a book points towards an author, the information in DNA points to a mind or an author of life. And the fourth argument is the moral argument. And quite simply, it's this. If there are objective moral values, God must exist. There are objective moral values, therefore God exists. So how do we know there are objective moral values? Well, as we know most recently with what our country is going through with protests and the Black Lives Matter movement, you know that they won justice for unarmed person being killed by another person. And the reality is that cries moral value, because we all know that that was wrong for someone to die at the hands of somebody else. No matter who they are, the skin color, or anything like that, we know that is morally wrong for that to take place. And so that's why we have riots and people angry about that. And so we know that it's wrong for other people to kill other people. And going with that too, secondly, we know that every human culture known to man has a moral law. C.S. Lewis in the book Abolition of Man puts it this way. Across cultures universally, there's a common principle that everybody knows and lives as if they're true. Character, honesty, courage, caring for others. They may look different in their practice in different cultures, but the principle remains the same, that they're held in a high level of esteem across cultures, across the world. And the question is, where do these ideas, this moral level comes from? And the idea is this, that there is a moral law. It points to a moral lawgiver. And the fifth and final thing we're going to talk about tonight is quite simply the resurrection of Jesus Christ. Jesus claimed to be God in human flesh. He died on the cross. The tomb is empty. There are radical accounts of Jesus appearing alive, and witnesses were willing to die for their conviction. And so the bottom line is this. The beginning of the universe points to a beginner. The fine-tuning is best explained by a fine-tuner. The DNA information points to the author of life. A moral law points to a moral lawgiver. And the resurrection of Jesus points to God entering into human history. Each one of those arguments by themselves is a good reason to let us believe that God does exist. But all of them together gives us just a definite answer that God does exist. And we can know that not only through Scripture, but also by what God has designed in the world and the universe around us. So tonight we're going to talk about a little bit more in depth in each one of those arguments and some other examples, and end with some scripture tonight that points more to this truth. So tonight, enjoy your time together. So thrilled that we get to go through this together, and I pray that at the end of tonight we can answer together, how do we know God exists? With certainty and with boldness and with courage, and share that with others.